I'm Olivia, a 35-year-old housewife with a life that looks perfect from the outside. We have the kind of house people envy, the kind of marriage that's supposed to be stable and secure. I have no real struggles to complain about, or so I keep telling myself. But lately, something feels wrong. It's not just dissatisfaction, it's deeper than that, like a quiet hum of discontent I can't seem to silence. Day by day, it grows louder, filling the empty spaces of my seemingly flawless life. Larry, my husband, and I still talk, but our conversations are surface level, polite, and efficient. How was your day? Fine. How was yours? It's all so mechanical, like we're business partners sharing a space rather than two people who once shared a love. The warmth we had, the spark, has been replaced by a cool, polite distance that neither of us acknowledges but both of us feel. Sometimes, I find myself watching him when he doesn't notice, searching for signs of the man I married. I wonder if he does the same with me, but I'm too afraid to ask. I can't pinpoint when things started to shift, only that the shift has become impossible to ignore. We go through the motions, keeping up appearances for the outside world, but inside, I feel like I'm suffocating. This isn't what I pictured for myself, for us. And yet, I don't know how to fix it, or if I even want to. At the company party, I felt like an accessory, just Larry's wife tagging along as he worked the room. These events always made me feel invisible, blending into the background as Larry showcased his achievements and connections. But then Paul, his boss, started talking to me. At first, it felt like standard small talk, but there was something different about the way he looked at me, like I was the most interesting person in the room. His eyes lingered just a moment too long, and his smile had an energy that caught me off guard. I laughed at something he said, and he leaned in slightly, closing the space between us. I felt a flutter of excitement, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. It was electric and intoxicating, and I hated how much I liked it. Paul had this undeniable magnetism, a way of commanding attention without trying. He made me feel seen, and that feeling, being noticed, being wanted, was something I hadn't realized I was starving for. As the evening went on, I found myself drawn to him, hanging on to his words and stealing glances. I knew it was dangerous, this pull I felt, but I didn't stop it. Deep down, I knew this was the beginning of something I shouldn't want, the start of a path I might not be able to walk away from. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I couldn't get Paul out of my mind. His charm, the way he made me feel seen, it lingered far longer than I wanted to admit. Each time I thought of him, a pang of guilt washed over me, but it was always accompanied by a jolt of excitement I couldn't suppress. It was a dangerous combination, and I knew it. In an attempt to push those feelings aside, I turned my attention back to Larry. We needed a spark, something to remind us of what we once had. One evening, I suggested we have a date night, a chance to reconnect without distractions. He agreed, though I couldn't tell if he was enthusiastic or simply going along with it to appease me. We went to a restaurant we used to love, but the conversation was stilted and awkward, as though we were strangers trying to make small talk. I tried to bring up memories of when we were younger, hoping to spark some warmth, but his responses were polite and distant, and I couldn't hide my frustration. Later that night, I made another effort, reaching for him in bed, but even that felt forced. His touch was hesitant, almost obligatory, and my heart sank. I'd hoped to reignite something between us, but instead, I was left with a deeper sense of emptiness. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifted back to Paul. The guilt twisted in my stomach, but so did the longing. I hated what this said about me, but I couldn't deny it any longer. Something fundamental in my marriage was broken, and I wasn't sure if it could be fixed. It happened so quickly, I could barely process it. One moment, Paul and I were standing in his office, going over some mundane detail of Larry's latest project. The next, his hand brushed against mine, and he looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was urgent, electric, and everything I didn't know I'd been longing for. For a few fleeting moments, the world disappeared. There was no Larry, no perfectly constructed life, no guilt, just Paul and the way he made me feel alive. When we pulled apart, reality crashed back in. My mind raced with 100 thoughts at once. What have I done? What does this mean? Paul didn't seem the least bit shaken, just calm and confident, as if this were inevitable. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment that I would bury and never let happen again. But the memory of that kiss stayed with me, replaying in my mind at the most inconvenient times. Over the next few weeks, I found myself inventing excuses to spend time at the office, to see Paul. One meeting turned into two, a touch on the arm turned into stolen moments behind closed doors, and before long, we were having an affair. Each encounter was intoxicating, a rush that left me breathless and wanting more. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, as though I'd stepped out of a haze I didn't even realize I'd been living in. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. Every time Larry asked how my day had been or smiled at me across the dinner table, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I told myself I could stop if I wanted to, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to at all. It happened in an instant, a moment I couldn't take back. Larry picked up my phone from the counter, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the screen. "Who's Paul?" he asked, his tone steady but sharp enough to cut through the air. My stomach dropped. For a second, I considered lying, spinning some story that might buy me time. But the look in his eyes told me it was too late. He already knew, or at least suspected. I confessed. The words spilled out faster than I could think, tumbling over one another as I admitted to the affair. I expected an explosion, but Larry didn't yell. Instead, he sat there, silent and pale, his jaw tightening with every word. His quiet anger was far worse than if he had screamed. The days that followed were tense and unbearable. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was curt and emotionless. I tried to explain myself, but every justification sounded hollow, even to my own ears. The weight of his disappointment crushed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. And yet, after days of silence and closed doors, he told me he wanted to try again. He wasn't ready to throw away everything we built, he said, and part of me felt relieved. But another part, one I hated to acknowledge, felt resentment bubbling beneath the surface. The idea of rebuilding our marriage felt exhausting, and I wasn't even sure if it was what I truly wanted. I'd fought so hard to feel alive again, and now, here I was, tethered back to the life I'd tried to escape. I smiled and agreed, telling Larry we could make this work. But deep down, I wondered if I was lying to him or to myself. Months have passed since I confessed, and life has settled into a tense rhythm. Larry and I are trying, or at least pretending to. I've thrown myself into being the perfect wife, doing everything I can to smooth over the cracks I caused. I make his favorite meals, laugh at his jokes, and try to rekindle the warmth we once had. But the restlessness is still there, simmering beneath the surface. No matter how hard I try to convince myself that this is enough, a part of me feels trapped. The house feels smaller, quieter. Larry's touch feels heavier, like a weight instead of comfort. Then Mark joined the firm. He's the new accountant, young, confident, and disarmingly handsome. The first time he smiled at me, I felt it, the same flutter I'd tried to bury after Paul. It caught me off guard, that rush of adrenaline, but I couldn't deny how alive it made me feel. Mark is charming in a way that seems effortless. He jokes with everyone, but when he talks to me, it feels different, like there's an unspoken understanding between us. I catch myself lingering in the break room when I know he's there or volunteering for tasks that might put us in the same meeting. I hate myself for it. I hate the way I'm drawn to him, the way my mind drifts when I'm supposed to be focused on Larry and repairing our marriage. I promised myself I'd do better, be better, but the temptation is gnawing at me. Every day feels like a tug-of-war between who I want to be and who I am. I want to be the good wife, the loyal partner, the person Larry deserves. But the craving for excitement, for that spark, is still there, whispering to me, daring me to take the risk again. I'm walking a tightrope, and I don't know how much longer I can hold my balance. I didn't mean for it to happen, not again. But somehow, I find myself seeking Mark out more often at work. It starts with small things, grabbing coffee at the same time, lingering after meetings, laughing at his jokes a little longer than necessary. His energy is magnetic, and the way he looks at me makes me feel like I'm the only person in the room. Our conversations are light, filled with teasing and playful banter. He compliments my ideas, notices little things like a new blouse or the way I've styled my hair. It's harmless, I tell myself, just two colleagues enjoying each other's company. But deep down, I know that's a lie. There's an unspoken tension between us, a charge in the air that's impossible to ignore. The way his hand brushes mine when he passes me a document or how his eyes linger just a second too long, it's subtle, but it's there. Each encounter leaves me feeling exhilarated and guilty all at once. I tell myself this is different, that I'm not crossing any lines, but the truth is, I'm walking dangerously close to the edge. I feel the pull, that same intoxicating rush I swore I'd never chase again, and I can't deny how much I crave it. Every day, the tension builds, tightening like a string that's bound to snap. I know where this road leads, and yet I can't seem to turn away. I've told myself I've learned my lesson, that I'm better now, but in moments like this, I'm not so sure. I don't even remember the moment I stopped resisting. Maybe it was the way Mark looked at me, all confidence and desire, or maybe it was the growing ache for something more in my life. Either way, I crossed the line, boldly, recklessly, and there was no turning back. Mark and I dove into the affair with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. We stole moments whenever we could, a lingering kiss in the office after hours, a quick rendezvous during lunch breaks, even whispered conversations in hidden corners. The risk made it all the more exhilarating. I didn't care who might notice or what might happen if they did. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive, and I was addicted to that feeling. But the cracks in my double life started showing almost immediately. At home, my behavior became erratic. One night, I'd be overly affectionate with Larry, cooking his favorite dinner and curling up next to him on the couch as if nothing had changed. The next, I'd be distant and irritable, snapping at him over the smallest things. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the unspoken questions he didn't dare ask. I told myself I could manage it, that I could keep the two worlds separate, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. The guilt gnawed at me, but not enough to stop me from going back to Mark. I hated the way I was treating Larry, but I couldn't seem to control myself. My emotions were all over the place. One moment, I was furious with him for not noticing the signs, the next, I was desperate to cling to the fragile semblance of our marriage. I was spiraling, and I knew it. But the rush of the affair, the way it made me feel like someone new, someone free, it was impossible to let go. Lying used to unsettle me, but now it feels second nature. I've mastered the art of balancing two worlds, daring and carefree with Mark, devoted and attentive with Larry. Each day is a performance, and I've grown skilled at covering my tracks, manipulating conversations, and deflecting suspicion. The thrill of my secret life is intoxicating, but it's also consuming me. I feel myself slipping further away from the person I once was. The lines between my true self and the persona I've created blur more with each lie I tell. Late at night, when the excitement fades, I'm left with the nagging fear that one wrong move will unravel everything. The rush keeps me going, but I can't ignore the weight of the deception slowly pulling me under. I knew something was off the moment Larry walked through the door. His usual quiet demeanor was replaced with a cold, calculating calm that sent a chill down my spine. He waited until dinner was over, his silence heavy, before dropping the bombshell. "I hired someone," he said, his voice steady but razor-sharp. "A private investigator. I know about you and Mark." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was frozen. But the fear quickly gave way to defiance. I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair as if his revelation didn't faze me. So, what? You've been spying on me now? That's how low you've sunk. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, damning evidence of my trysts with Mark. My stomach churned, but I refused to show it. Instead, I scoffed, tossing the folder aside. Is this supposed to humiliate me? Make me feel guilty? Because it won't, I said, my voice cold and biting. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. Larry's expression didn't waver, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. For a moment, guilt flickered inside me, but I quickly smothered it. Instead, I turned the confrontation on its head, spinning every accusation into an attack on him. You're not blameless in this, I continued. You've been checked out for years, Larry. You think hiring someone to dig into my personal life makes you the victim here? It doesn't. He didn't argue, and his silence only fueled my anger. I was cornered, but I wasn't about to back down. If anything, I was determined to twist the situation to my advantage, to maintain some semblance of control. But as I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me, the weight of the confrontation lingered. For all my bravado, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed facade was starting to crumble. The barbecue started like any other, but when Jeremy, Larry's best friend, caught my eye, everything shifted. Our conversation turned into something more, and in a reckless, wine-fueled moment, I crossed yet another line. The act was impulsive, desperate, and left me feeling hollow. The next day, Jeremy confessed everything to Larry. His devastation was unmistakable, and the silence that followed cut deeper than any argument. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the polite smiles of friends turned into cold stares and whispers. I had destroyed more than my marriage, I'd ruined my reputation and isolated myself completely. For the first time, I began to feel the full weight of the chaos I had unleashed. The backlash was immediate and brutal. My family, once supportive despite their reservations, now barely hid their disappointment. Friends I'd known for years distanced themselves, their harsh words cutting deeper than I thought possible. It felt like the walls were closing in, and for the first time, I couldn't find a way to spin the narrative in my favor. I tried to explain, to justify my actions, to them, to Larry, to myself, but the words felt hollow, even to my own ears. What excuse could possibly make sense of the chaos I'd caused? The truth was, I didn't know why I kept sabotaging the very life I claimed to want. Nights became sleepless marathons of regret and self-doubt. I replayed every decision, every lie, every betrayal, wondering where it all went so wrong. The reality of my choices was suffocating, and the cracks in my carefully crafted facade were finally breaking wide open. For the first time, I couldn't escape the truth. I wasn't just losing the people around me, I was losing myself. The knock on the door felt heavier than usual, the kind that carries bad news. When I opened it, there stood a courier with an envelope, divorce papers. My hands shook as I read the words, the finality of it hitting me like a punch to the gut. Larry wasn't just angry or hurt, he was done. The proceedings began quickly, and I walked into the courtroom expecting to maintain control. But I was wrong. Larry, once so passive and reserved, had clearly been preparing for this moment. His lawyer was sharp, presenting a case that painted me in the worst possible light. Every secret, every lie, every betrayal, laid bare for the court to see. My affairs with Paul and Mark, my reckless actions, even Jeremy's confession, they all became weapons aimed squarely at me. I sat there, stunned, as Larry's calm and collected demeanor contrasted sharply with my growing panic. I had always been the one pulling the strings, but now I was on the defensive, scrambling to keep up. The humiliation was overwhelming, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the ruling. Each word felt like a hammer blow. Larry would have full custody of the children, the family home would remain his, and I was ordered to move out. I sat there, numb, struggling to process the finality of it all. I had told myself for weeks that I could win, that I could salvage some part of my old life. But now, staring at the judge's solemn expression, I realized how wrong I'd been. Packing my belongings was agonizing, each item a reminder of the life I'd destroyed. The laughter that once filled the house was replaced with quiet sobs as I hugged my children goodbye. They clung to me, their tear-streaked faces breaking what was left of my heart. As I stepped outside, the weight of my choices finally hit me. This wasn't just a punishment, it was the harsh reality I'd created for myself. I stood on the threshold of an unfamiliar future, haunted by the echoes of the life I'd thrown away. The small apartment was a far cry from the home I'd left behind. The walls felt oppressively close, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Each day bled into the next, the weight of my mistakes pressing down on me. Then came the final blow, I lost my job. The one semblance of stability I had left was gone. In my desperation, I reached out to Paul and Mark. I told myself they'd understand, that they'd help. But both rejected me, their curt responses making it clear I was no longer part of their lives. The loneliness was unbearable, and I sank deeper into a depression I couldn't shake. Weeks later, during a supervised visit with my children, my daughter's wide, innocent eyes locked onto mine. "Mommy," she asked softly, "why don't you live with us anymore?" Her question pierced through my haze of self-pity. For the first time, I saw the full extent of what I'd done, not just to myself, but to my children. That moment, as painful as it was, felt like a jolt of clarity. Something has to change. Starting therapy felt like stepping into the unknown. I was terrified to face myself, to confront the roots of my behavior and the damage I had caused. But as the sessions progressed, I began peeling back the layers of my choices, my need for validation, my fear of vulnerability, and my relentless pursuit of excitement at any cost. For the first time, I took responsibility for my actions, no longer hiding behind excuses or shifting blame. It was excruciating to admit the pain I'd inflicted on Larry, my children, and even myself. But it was also liberating, a small step toward rebuilding the person I wanted to be. With shaky resolve, I tried to make amends. Some efforts were met with understanding, others with anger and rejection. I wrote Larry a letter apologizing for everything, but his response was cool, guarded. My children were hesitant, their trust not easily restored. Every step reminded me of the long-lasting consequences of my betrayal. This wasn't a quick fix or a redemption arc, it was a slow, painstaking journey. But for the first time, I wasn't running from the damage. I was facing it head-on, determined to rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage. Finding a job as a waitress wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. The steady rhythm of taking orders, serving tables, and earning tips brought a sense of structure back into my life. At first, I was embarrassed to be starting over like this, but over time, I began to take pride in the work. It was honest, and for once, I was standing on my own 2 feet. Joining a support group was even harder. Sitting in a circle of strangers, sharing the most shameful parts of my story, felt like exposing a raw wound. But I stayed. Week after week, I listened, learned, and slowly began to open up. Their stories mirrored mine in ways I didn't expect, and their empathy helped me see that change was possible. As the months passed, I started to rebuild my self-esteem, not through compliments or fleeting thrills, but through small, meaningful steps. I learned to find joy in simple things, a kind word from a customer, a peaceful evening alone, or a heartfelt conversation with my children during their visits. It wasn't easy. My old habits of seeking validation still lingered, whispering doubts and temptations. But each day, I fought to reform those behaviors, choosing growth over comfort. For the first time in years, I began to see myself as someone worth saving, not because of how others saw me, but because of how I was learning to see myself. Rebuilding bridges with my children and family was the hardest part of my journey. I knew I couldn't undo the pain I'd caused, but I was determined to make amends, no matter how long it took. With my children, every visit was a delicate dance. Their initial excitement to see me was often overshadowed by hesitation. They asked questions that broke my heart, their young minds trying to understand why their world had fallen apart. I answered honestly, even when the truth was painful, hoping to earn their trust back through consistency and patience. My family was less forgiving. Some greeted my efforts with outright skepticism, while others avoided me altogether. I couldn't blame them, my actions had hurt more than just Larry and the kids. I had betrayed the values they thought I stood for. Despite the resistance, I pressed on. I showed up, kept my promises, and let my actions speak louder than words. It was slow and often discouraging, but I could see small glimmers of hope. A smile from my son, a hug from my daughter, or a civil conversation with a wary sibling felt like monumental victories. I didn't expect to be fully forgiven or to reclaim the relationships I'd lost overnight. But I was committed to proving, day by day, that my change was real and that I was capable of becoming someone they could trust again. A year later, things had shifted in ways I never thought possible. My visitation rights had progressed to overnight stays with the kids, and those nights were the brightest part of my week. We were slowly finding a rhythm: movie nights, bedtime stories, shared laughter, but the shadow of the past still lingered. One evening, during a drop-off, Larry and I found ourselves alone in the driveway. The kids were inside, their excited voices muffled by the walls of his house. We stood there, the awkward silence stretching between us. I fumbled with my car keys, unsure of what to say. Then, Larry spoke. It wasn't much, just a comment about how well the kids seemed to be doing lately. But his tone lacked the sharpness it once carried, and for the first time in years, it felt like we weren't enemies. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was something, a tentative thaw, a small step toward civility. Navigating our post-divorce family dynamics was complicated, full of unspoken tension and fragile moments like this. I knew there would be no going back to what we once had, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted that. But I held on to the hope that we could move forward, creating a healthier, more supportive environment for the kids, and maybe, one day, even for ourselves. 1 year of fare-free. I sit alone in my small apartment, a single candle flickering on the table, marking the milestone. There's no celebration, no one to share the moment with. Just me and the heavy silence. The year has been excruciating. I've fought every day to resist the pull of temptation, the allure of escape. But even now, the cravings linger, whispering promises of fleeting joy in my weakest moments. I've resisted, but the battle has left me weary and hollow. The damage I've done to my family feels insurmountable. Larry has moved on, building a life where I'm little more than a ghost. My children are growing up without me fully there, their trust in me so fractured it may never heal. Their laughter, once a sound that filled me with pride, now cuts like a knife, a reminder of the mother I failed to be. I sit staring at a photo of us from happier times. My children are so small, their faces lit with pure joy. Larry's arm is around me, his smile easy and unguarded. It's a snapshot of a life I destroyed, and no amount of progress will ever bring it back. The loneliness is crushing. There are nights I stare at my phone, scrolling through names I no longer have the right to call, imagining what I'd say if I could. But what good are apologies now? They'd only reopen wounds I inflicted. I've made strides this year, faced truths I spent a lifetime avoiding, stopped running from the person I was. But the weight of who I am, what I've done, feels unbearable at times. The future stretches out before me, a long road of solitude and regret. I blow out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The silence swallows me whole, but I sit with it, letting the pain wash over me. This is my reality now. I can't undo the past, and the scars I've left behind are a burden I'll carry forever. I'll keep trying, though. Not for redemption, I know that's beyond me, but because it's the only way forward. One day at a time, I'll face the life I've created, no matter how broken it is.